Hey guys, welcome back. Chris here with Marksman Shooting Sports and WeBuyGuns.com in Westfield, Indiana, and you are watching Marksman TV. Welcome back to another weekly used gun review. Real quick, I know I have not had very many of these out lately. We have been very busy. If you guys have not been watching the unboxing videos, I explain this. We're trying to hire, so until I can get some people on, these videos do take me a little bit of time. I'm not going to be as frequent with them, maybe one every other week for now is what I'm going to try my best to do. If I can get more out, I'm going to try and get more out. But a lot of people have been emailing me and calling and asking, are we done with the weekly used gun review? No, we are not. This is just a temporary thing while we try and get all this extra work coming in from the website out from under us, or we can get out from under it so I can get back to doing more videos more frequently for you guys. So thank you for your understanding there. Remember, the point of these videos is strictly to be entertaining and educational. We are not making these to sell anything. So with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into it now. Alright, this video is brought to you by our website, WeBuyGuns.com. If you are considering selling a firearm or firearms collection, please visit our site, create an account, and from there you can submit your firearms for an offer. Now with the offer, you will get a printable offer certificate, which you can take with you to competing gun stores in your area to try and leverage yourself a better deal. If you're unable to get a better deal, go ahead and sell them to us. We do provide you with a shipping label, and we will pay you with either a paper check or ACH direct deposit, your choice, to make the process as easy for you as possible. So please go check us out at WeBuyGuns.com. Remember, the format of this video is we take 8 firearms, starting off with the most common and move through least common as the video progresses, starting off with our first firearm. Now this one comes to us from a viewer here locally, so thank you so much for selling this one to us. This is a Walther Model P99. This is a 9mm, somewhat of a double and single action, which I'll explain a little bit about, polymer frame handgun. Now, Walther would release this pistol in 1997. It would see some revisions in about 2005 as the P99AS, and I'll explain a little bit about those revisions in a minute. Now, if we look at the history leading up to this design, you could say that Walther's first big commercial and militarily successful full-size 9mm handgun was the famed Walther P38, which was used by the Germans in World War II. Now, post-World War II, you would have a aluminum frame, or an alloy frame, if you will, a variant of the P38 known as the P1, a shorter barreled variant of that known as the P4. Then a more modern handgun would come onto the scene in the 1970s known as the P5, and in the 1980s they would have the P88. The P88 being the first double-stacked modern style, I guess you could say, 9mm handgun. Now, as we're moving through the end of the 80s, we have polymer frame handguns emerging onto this scene, especially for police and military purposes. Walther wanted to join in on this, so in about 1994, they would start development of their own polymer frame handgun, and by 1997, they were ready to come out with this, the P99, onto the market. Now, it's got some innovative features about it. It's got a very interesting design to the grip, which is actually very comfortable. It is also modular. The P99 was the first ever to incorporate interchangeable back straps, which these come with it in the box, so very innovative in that regard as well. Now, one of the most interesting features about the P99 is the double single action variation of the handgun, which they call the anti-stress feature. So when you have the firearm armed and ready to fire, you do see a red armed striker indicator in the back of the pistol. Now from there, you are in a single action mode. There is a very, very light take up just to stage the trigger from the front to the back. You heard a little click there. Now it's sort of in a single action mode with a very light pull and a very, very short, right there, reset. Very nice trigger. Now, if you are in single action and you want to go to double action with a double action trigger pull, you push on this button here in the back. You'll see that red pin drop. Of course, that would not discharge the firearm, but that has put us onto double action with a very heavy trigger pull. Now, of course, it would cycle there and go back to a single action with a very short reset. Interesting firearm design. Now, this would see contracts with military and police all around the world, and was actually famed by being in the James Bond handgun lineup, especially if you're a fan of the movies and the later movies with Daniel Craig. You do see the P99 on the silver screen in those movies as well. Now, in 2005, Walther would want to refresh the design, and they would come out with the P99 AS, AS standing for anti-stress, which is a little bit interesting to me because the original P99 did have the anti-stress trigger system. But they would make updates to the grip, making it a little bit, I guess you could say, more texture on the grip, but they kept the interchangeable back straps. They would add longer and wider serrations on the slide. They would change this from a proprietary to a standard rail underneath the barrel. They would get rid of this slope inside the trigger guard. They would actually round out the trigger guard, and they would elongate the magazine release in this paddle style. So those who are not familiar, the mag release is actually a paddle right here, which you hit down with your thumb or your index finger on either side to drop the mag. Now this is a little bit short to get to, so on the AS they elongated it to about half the length of the bottom of the trigger guard. That is a variation of the P99 that is manufactured today, known by many collectors as the Generation 2. So the P99 is actually a personal favorite of mine. I am a big fan of this handgun, and when it comes to all double-stacked Walther handguns, the P99 is actually my favorite, and I prefer it over things like the PPQ. Now, if we look at the market on these things, they have always sat around. If you look at the new manufacturer like the P99 AS, they have always sat in line with things like the XDs, the Glocks, the M&Ps, at between about $500 and $600 new. Used, you should be able to find them between about $400 and $500 or so. So I actually prefer the first gen standard P99. It's just a little bit more classic to me, and I just really like the feel. But the pricing actually between the two is not much different. So it's just a matter of which features and style you like more. But anyway, that is our first handgun, the Walther P99. All right, up next we have one that comes to us actually from a local customer. So this is actually the brand new Beretta M9A4, and I already have one used. I'll go ahead and open it up and be right back. All right, guys, so the handgun comes in like this little ammo thing. If you've had an M9A3 or looked at one, you're gonna be very familiar with that. This comes with 3 18-round magazines, and you have the Beretta, what they call the Vertec grip system, which is actually a lot thinner profile than the M9A3, and I'll go through all of that. You have a interchangeable panel over here as well, and then there's your spare magazines. So the M9A4, which is of course most closely related to the M9A3. So a little bit of a history on that first. Of course, the United States military would adopt the M9 handgun as part of the M9 handgun trials in about 1982, replacing the 1911. Now, that would stay in U.S. military service all the way up until about 2015, when the United States put out a solicitation for a new service sidearm through the XM17 handgun trials. Now, we all know that SIG would end up winning that contract with the P320 platform, known as the M17, and also the M18, the shorter version of that, being adopted. Now, it saw a lot of competitors in that trial. One of the biggest one was the Glock 19X, but another one that is a little bit lesser known was the M9A3. Now, Beretta, of course, wanted to continue enjoying the military contracts. They knew that the military wanted something a little bit more modern, so they preemptively came out with the M9A3 design, which looked a little bit, well, looked a lot like this. It was a flat dark earth in color, just like all the other XM17 handguns that were put through trial. Had a much shallower grip angle. It did have a rail system using like the M9A1 style rail system, and it did have a threaded barrel, but they had a lot of things that they tried to incorporate to be successful in that trial. Now, to my recollection, the United States military did not actually even accept the M9A3 as a competitor in the trial. They flat out rejected anything on the M9 pattern altogether and opting to go for something else. So Beretta would come out to the US consumer market in around 2015, 2016 with the M9A3, and we have not seen any new releases on the M9 family until this, the M9A4, which actually hit the market just a few months ago, so I already have a used one. Now, some of the changes that they made, of course, if you're familiar with the M9A3, I'm going to use that as the basis for talking about this, but they added front slide serrations. They did that because you have an optics cut here in the back now, so you can run optics. That's sort of a must-have in a modern handgun system in this day and age. Everything is all about running handgun optics. So with that optic here, not being able to reach these serrations, you have the front serrations that you can use. They did improve the trigger, which they call the Beretta Extreme Short Reset Trigger. Now, this was actually upgraded with a Langdon Tactical trigger, so that's not going to mean much to you guys when I show you the trigger, but this trigger, Langdon Tactical, also has a, I'll show you guys that again, very short, right there, reset. Very nice trigger. Of course, I already talked about the Vertec grips that they incorporated on here. So this is a much narrower grip system. They did put dovetailed tritium night sights, which you're not going to get on the M9A3. Now this one is the G model, and on the G model Berettas, this actually returns back to the fire position. It does not stay on safe. It is a decocker only. So a couple modern revisions on this, and the interesting thing is typically when you come out with a refreshed design, they tend to come way up in price. I'm actually seeing these new on the market at about $1,000, which is always where about the M9A3s were. So I can imagine that the M9A3s, if you were thinking about getting one, are coming down in price. In fact, I've been seeing that as I make offers on used ones. I've been seeing that the used market on M9A3s is already coming down as a result of these coming out. Used on the market on these, you're still seeing these between about $800 and $900. Especially if they're really good condition in the original packaging, because you know, still the M9A4s you can actually find pretty regularly if you look in places like Gunbroker, new or used, but there's not a huge price difference between new and used M9A4s right now. So about maybe $800 to $900 right now on these used. So that's basically the rundown on that. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, up next is another one that comes to us from a local customer, so thank you so much for selling this one to us. This is an Intratech Tech 9. This is actually specifically the AB10. I'll talk a little bit about that, but if you're talking about firearms that are probably the most infamous here in the United States consumer market, the Tech 9 is definitely one that is on the top of the list. Very iconic. Most people know what these are, or at least have seen the silhouette and sort of equate it to 80s and 90s crime and shootings and things like that. So definitely has had a pretty bad reputation here in the United States. If you've been around firearms in the 80s and 90s, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The Intratech Tech 9. So first of all, the story with this would begin with a company called Interdynamic AB based out of Sweden. They wanted to come up with a very simple and inexpensive submachine gun that they could use both domestically and export to military and law enforcement around the world. So Interdynamic would get to work on what would be the MP9. Looks very similar to this, but you would have a vertical grip. And it did not see a whole lot of success. It was actually very simple. It was successful. It was relatively reliable, and it was cheap and easy to manufacture. And it was based off of earlier Carl Gustloff submachine gun designs. Now, because it was not seeing a lot of commercial success abroad in Sweden, they decided that they would create an American-based subsidiary due to our booming gun market that, you know, of course, we have private ownership of firearms, so they wanted to move manufacturing to the United States and try their hand at U.S., manufacturing in the United States consumer market. So they would open a subsidiary in Interdynamic in Florida in the United States, and they would get to work with a semi-automatic design for the U.S. commercial market. Now, the first product they would come out with was known as the KG9. The MP9, which is the submachine gun that they manufactured, was a straight blowback that worked on an open bolt design. You pull the bolt back, it stays open, resting on a sear. You pull the trigger, it drops the bolt, firing the firearm. Now, in a full auto, as long as the trigger is pulled, that'll keep cycling. On a semi-automatic, that engages a different sear, which holds the bolt back. You let off the trigger, that switches over to the trigger sear, and then you can pull the trigger again, firing in semi-auto, but it is firing on an open bolt principle, which is, in the eyes of the ATF, too easily converted into a full auto machine gun. So shortly after the introduction of the KG9 in the US in the early 80s, the ATF would require Interdynamic to convert it to a closed bolt semi-automatic design. So they would get to work. And about a year later, they would come out with the KG99, exact same firearm, but firing from a closed bolt with an internal hammer system. And that mechanism would actually stay with the firearm all the way up through its end in the early 2000s. Now, the firearm was met with sort of lukewarm success. It was built on a polymer frame and did have a tendency for the frames to crack under hotter pressure loads. It was not super reliable, but it was incredibly inexpensive. It fed from a detachable 32-round box magazine. They also made 20-round and 10-round magazines, and it had a very ominous, scary, and iconic look to it. So it did find a place among a lot of different crime elements in the United States through the late 80s and early 90s. Now, in 1985, the company would rebrand into Intratec, and they would come out with their first product, the Tech 9. Now, the Tech 9 looks a lot like this. It's in form and function. It is identical, except it does have sling mounting points up where the barrel shroud would be and here on the back instead of the single point. It had a barrel shroud that was also threaded at the end, so you could put on this fake barrel extension / suppressor sort of thing. And they fixed the frame issue, so the firearms did become more reliable. Now, in 1989 in California, there was an event known as the Stockton Schoolyard Shooting, where a guy shot up a elementary school playground, killing several children. Now, there was a ban that ensued in California where several firearms were banned by name, one of those being the Tech 9. So, Intratec had to rebrand the handgun, first by removing the ominous barrel shroud, and second by moving the sling mounting points to a single point sling mount here in the back. And they rebranded it as the DC9, DC standing for Designed for California. They would manufacture that between about 1990 and 1994 when the assault weapons ban would come out, and it would be banned by name again. Intratec would then come out with another design known as the AB10, AB standing for after ban and 10 standing for the capacity, because what they would do is take the DC9, remove the barrel threads here, and they would sell it with a 10-round magazine instead of the 32-round magazine. But of course, the previous 32-round and 20-round mags would still fit in the firearm if you could source one. Now, these would gain even further scrutiny when they would be used in gang-related incidents, as well as the Columbine shooting in 1999. And by 2001, Intratec was actually dissolved and all production on these pistols would cease. So you can no longer pick them up brand new anymore, but you can find them on the used market. So they do have a little bit of an interesting history to them, following different bans and things going on in the country in the 80s and 90s. But interesting no less. And they do still have a reputation of being pretty bad in terms of reliability. On the market today, the different Tech 9 variants, the Tech 9, the DC9, and the AB10, are pretty close in price. You typically find them in really good condition between about $600 to $700 or so, and that's usually about where the market caps off on them. But anyway, very interesting pistols. We will move on to the next one. All right, guys, next one up is a really cool little pistol, and if you guys have been watching our unboxing videos, we got this in from a customer in Illinois several weeks ago, but I held on to it because it's interesting and I really wanted to put it in one of these videos. But what we have here is a Sauer Sons Model 1913, 32 automatic straight blowback pistol. Now, around the turn of the century, there was a Georg Roth, however you pronounce it, had come up with an interesting pistol design, which he produced and patented, and then the firearm went into manufacturing under J.P. Sauer Sons. And that was their first introduction into self-loading semi-automatic pistols. Now, a few years later in 1913, they would come up with their own at-home design, or one that they had come up with and derived and manufactured, and that was this, the 1913. So this is the first self-loading semi-automatic handgun that J.P. Sauer Sons would build from start to finish. Prior to that, I mean, J.P. Sauer Sons is an arms manufacturer that has been around since about the 1700s and is the oldest living arms manufacturer of Germany at the time. So this was an interesting sort of feat and development for them, moving them sort of into the modern era of self-loading pistols. Now, as this was being developed around 1912 to 1913, this is just on the heels of World War I, about to kick off a year later. This was really intended for the consumer market, going to be sort of a personal defensive firearm. But, of course, when the war would kick off, war material was needed, and several of these were folded into German military service, about 10,000 units or so, mostly seeing issue with NCOs, officers, things like that. Now, private soldiers and officers who were not issued these could purchase them on the private market and use them in war, and oftentimes they did. But militarily marked 1913s from the World War I era, there was about 10,000 of them. You do have the German crown in the nitro proof marks, the smokeless powder proof marks that you find on a lot of the Weimar era German firearms. Now, after the war would conclude, they would actually put this on the shelf for about a period of 4 years and then resume production of these in the 1920s. These did see a series of different design changes through about the 1920s and 1930s. This is a third model. The quickest way you can tell is the way the safety is derived. There's this little catch here underneath the safety, and that is indicative of a third pattern. So this is sort of a later production. Now, these would stay in production until about 1935. Keep in mind, Germany is starting to very quietly rearm. Hitler's been in power for a couple years, and there's new entrants into the market with more modern, small frame firearms, most notably the Walther PP and PPK. Sauer would then come out with a new model of their own to compete with the PP and the PPK, known as the 38H, which is most notably the Sauer handgun that was used in the Second World War. Mauser was coming up with things like the HSC as well. Now, a couple interesting things about this particular firearm is this was likely made in the late 20s to very early 1930s. This is very much an interwar pistol. It does have a holster with a World War II era. It's actually dated 1938 Berlin. It has the eagle mark on it. So this is, I would call it, into the World War II era. This has a couple interesting markings on it. This is marked right here, 1920. The 1920 is the Reichswehr stamp. And then right up here on the front, this is pretty interesting too. This is marked PWB, which stands for Polizeiwehr Bayern. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, which is a Bavarian police force. So this is actually manufactured and used for Bavarian police, so it's police marked, which makes this a little bit interesting. Now, at some point, this had to have likely ended up maybe in Berlin or somewhere else in Germany, as it did actually come accompanied with capture papers. The capture papers, for those who don't know, these are a really interesting piece of provenance to have with any firearm, especially from World War II. At this time, this is not practiced anymore, unfortunately, but at this time, soldiers engaged in foreign war, they could, if they had come across captured firearms, they could actually get the permission slip, if you will, the bring back papers, as collectors call them, from their commanding officer in order to bring them home as a war trophy. So this one is actually Private First Class Joseph Demansky, with serial number provided. Picked this up somewhere. It doesn't really list where he was when he collected this, but this was the 10th of July in 1945, so right at the conclusion of World War II. The war had been over a couple months. But he had picked this up, was probably about to ship home, got the capture papers, went through the appropriate channels at the time. A lot of people brought things home without doing this. Went through the appropriate channels and was able to take this home and back home in the United States as a war souvenir. So these are just a really cool piece of provenance. And they did list the items, so they have a list where you could put the different captured items, and it was listed as pistol caliber 32, serial number 1920, which is actually incorrect. As mentioned, this is the Reichswehr stamp. The serial number is on this side, and then there's the the NCO, the John Johnson, First Lieutenant, 27th Tank Battalion. I wasn't in the military. 27th TKBN. I assume that means Tank Battalion, but correct me if I'm wrong. So really cool piece of interesting history and provenance. Now, the value of things like this. These are actually pretty overlooked in terms of collectibles from German military service. Usually the World War II stuff, the Sauer 38Hs and the HSCs, are going to have more value and more collectability. These things, in normal condition, you might find them around the $500 to $600 mark or so. So they are not super expensive. But anyway, that is a really cool piece with interesting provenance and history. Interesting to be able to trace where it was and how it came back to the country. So happy to share that one with you guys. Okay, up next is an interesting firearm that comes to us from a local customer here in Indiana. So thank you so much for selling this one to us. This is a Springfield Model 1873 Trapdoor chambered in 4570. Now this particular one is actually manufactured by H&R, Harrington and Richardson, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. But if we look at the history with this would actually start back around the time of the American Civil War. Now at that time you have U.S. troops running around shooting at each other with 58 caliber muzzle-loaded rifles, and at that time you have the emergence of new self-contained cartridges and repeating rifles, breech-loaded rifles, things like the 1860 Henry lever-action rifle chambered in 44 rimfire. Now, with the two happening simultaneously, it became very clear to the United States Ordnance Department that the self-contained rifle cartridge, breech-loaded firearms are going to be the future of small arms development, and the countries or the militaries that don't adopt that quickly are going to be quickly left behind and outmatched on the battlefield. So in about 1865, the U.S. Ordnance Department would get to work. This would be spearheaded by Brigadier General Alfred Terry, who would put out a solicitation for a new breech-loaded firearm. Now, there were 100 different submissions by different companies and manufacturers, of which none of them would actually be adopted by the U.S. military. Instead, what they decided they wanted to do is take all the 58 caliber muzzle loaders that were actually already in inventory and paid for and convert them into a self-contained rifle cartridge firearm loaded through the breech. Now, there was a master gunsmith at Springfield Armory at the time known as Erskine Allen, who took the task of taking the firearms and converting them into a breech load, and he came up with the so-called Allen conversion, which was the first stab at what would turn into the 1873. Now, those would do well, and the retrofit was well done. They would basically, you have the hammer mechanism, you go to half cock, you have this door, such as the trapdoor, that would open. You would then pop one round of 4570 government into the chamber, to the breech, close it behind it, it would lock, you would go to full cock, and then you would fire. You then go to half cock, you open this up, there's an automatic ejector in there that kicks out the casing, you pop in a new one, and you continue firing. This drastically improved the speed in which troops could get led downrange in military combat scenarios. Now, by about 1872, they decided to come up with a proprietary design, a whole new built design, and by 1873, it would be released and adopted as the 1873 rifle by Springfield, the trapdoor rifle. Now, these would actually stay in production until about the 1890s, when it would be replaced by the Krag Jorgensen and the 3040 Krag, where now you have an internal box magazine and you're not loading one at a time. So that would be the next advancement into the 1903, and so on. The rest is history. So a very interesting firearm with an interesting, it's a very interesting developmental change in the way the U.S. Ordnance Department was looking into moving forward. Now, if we look at the H&R rifle, this was actually, and it's kind of hard to find a little bit of information on this, this is going to be a commercial reproduction, of course, and this would be brought about by H&R in about the 1970s. They did have two configurations. They had the full rifle length with a ramrod, I don't know why, and they had the carbine, saddle ring carbine variation. This one has a rear vernier tang-mounted sight on it, also chambered in 4570. Now, these would be produced for about 10 years by H&R until about the early 1980s, when H&R would actually start seeing some financial trouble. They would actually drop these from production. So anyway, very interesting firearms, and happy to get that one and to share it with you guys. All right, up next is a very interesting shotgun that comes to us from a viewer in Florida. So thank you so much for selling this one to us. This is a high standard Model 10B Police, and it is basically a bullpup semi-automatic 12-gauge shotgun. Now, the story with this would actually begin in the 1950s. There was a Santa Monica police sergeant whose name was Alfred Crouch, who wanted to come up with the ultimate SWAT entry shotgun. It was really meant to be light, it could be modular, it could have a flashlight or other accessories mounted to it, it could be operated by one hand, and it would be reliable. Now, he himself would come up with a sort of bullpup type of configuration based off of a Remington semi-automatic shotgun, and he did see some limited success with his design through personal practice and use. Now, through about the 1960s, he would actually sell the rights to the design to High Standard, and High Standard would sort of tinker with the design elements of it, encapsulating it in its own C1200 Supermatic semi-automatic shotgun, and this is the product that they would come up with in the 1960s. Now, there are a couple interesting features on this. As it is a bullpup, it's basically a stripped-down C1200 Supermatic with the stock removed and everything put into this sort of bullpup type chassis. You still have the bolt on this side with the charging handle here, but you have a charging handle on this side as well, so you can operate it here. The most interesting characteristic of this is this sort of, this kind of reminds me of a fish, but kind of this rear fin looking stock that actually rotates 360 degrees all around. And that is so you can actually pivot the orientation of the stock. I actually played with this a little bit, trying to like look around corners and stuff, and actually the stock could pivot into your shoulder as you're moving, which is actually kind of a cool and weird feel. But it made it so, like, normally if you kind of tilt the shotgun, you start digging the heel of the rifle or the shotgun into your shoulder, it actually stays with your shoulder as it moves. The other thing you can do is if you're moving it down to a one-handed position, you can actually rotate it completely around and rest it against your bicep. So kind of an interesting design. I don't really quite know what I think about it, and neither did a lot of the police departments who used it. You got a carry handle here. You have a mounting system for a proprietary mag light holder sort of device. You can mount your flashlight on it. Polymer construction of this chassis system is actually relatively lightweight, and standard capacity was only 4 rounds, although they did make magazine tube extensions. You had a front blade sight that could actually fold down out of the way here with sling mounted points on the front and the rear. Very, very weird and unorthodox design, to say the least. Now, this would actually see some success with police departments through the 60s and the 70s. However, in practice, it was very quickly determined that these are really not the best shotguns for police use. One of the main issues that they had was reliability. These were intended only to be used with high brass, buckshot, slugs, or game loads. And even with that, it would definitely see a lot of cycling issues. These are definitely prone to stoppage in practice, which of course for a police shotgun you do not want. Also, it did have a limited capacity, and because it was a bullpup, it could only be used with right-handed shooters. Left-handed shooters could not actually use this, or they would catch brass in their face. And the way that the contours of this works, just you can't, ergonomically, you can't rest that up against your cheek. So, too many limitations for what it was, and by the late 70s, these are basically extinct from police market. So they have seen some success, or I shouldn't say success, or they've been sort of showcased in different video games and movies, mainly due to its very unique look and style. So for that, it's definitely got some pop culture appeal and collectability. On the used market, in really, really good condition, I see these top out at about $1,000 or maybe a hair more. This one I would call in good condition. It's got some definite wear and signs of use and things like that. But you know, something like this sub $1,000. So interesting firearm. Happy to get that one in and share it with you guys. Okay, next up is a really interesting pistol that comes to us from a viewer in Oregon. So thank you so much for sending this one to us. As the box would suggest, this is a Walther P4 with police holster and 2 magazines, which is pretty cool, if I can get the holster open. Now, a lot of people who are not familiar with the P1 and P4 may be thinking, gee, that looks an awful lot like a P38, and it is really much derived off of the P38. The P38 was designed by Walther in 1938 and would serve as the main primary issue sidearm for the German military in the Second World War. Although it was, you know, there was ancillary use with Lugers and the smaller frame pistols like the HSCs and the PPKs and PPs as well, but the P38 was essentially standard issue at the time. Now, it is a very popular design, single stack, 8-round capacity, 9mm with a top eject. Elements of this have been used on other popular designs like the Beretta M9 or 92FS comes to mind, or the Croatian PHP MV1. But this was actually one of, or regarded as one of the best and most successful handgun designs coming out of the Second World War, along things like the Radom Viz and the Belgian High Power. Now, as everybody knows, Germany would lose the war and they had to cease production of military equipment and firearms, so Walther moved a lot of their production to Menurin in France, who took up production of the P38 variants as well as the PP and the PPK. Now, they would come up with, through about the 1950s, Germany would start being allowed to rearm its local military, the Bundeswehr, and they would sort of go back to the P38 design and make some changes. One of the biggest things they would do is adopt an alloy frame. The steel was not necessary for the P38. A nice, good quality alloy frame was absolutely, substantial enough for the pistol to see a good service life without any sort of detrimental failures, and it cut down dramatically on manufacturing costs and the weight of the firearm. So they would come out with what was known as the P1 through about the late 1950s, early 1960s on the alloy frame, and in about 1963 or so it would be adopted by the Bundeswehr as their official sidearm. Now that was to stay in production through the 1960s into the 1970s when they would adopt a new version. They wanted to simplify the design, so they would come out with this, the P4. On the P4 you're getting rid of the top plate, which would basically hold down the rear sight and have your firing mechanisms accessible through the top. They got rid of that whole assembly and replaced it with a simple machine screw holding in the rear sight. They did shorten the barrel, which is the quickest way you can identify you're looking at a P4. They changed the decocker safety strictly to a decocker, shortening the spur on the hammer. And those were essentially the big changes that they made to the P4. They would not make very many of these before the P5 pistol would come out, replacing the P1 and the P4 altogether. And so actually the P4 is a pretty rare variant of the P38 family altogether. It's still very interesting and very cool. Now, these were made both for the commercial market and for the German police. This is a police gun identified by the P4 markings. as well as the police-proof marks would have actually been here, where this machine recess ovular cut has been made. So really cool, interesting firearms, and I have not seen too many P4s actually come through. If we look at the market today, most of your P4s sell anywhere from about $600 to maybe about $1,000, depending on the condition you find them in. This one is in excellent condition with the holster, 2 magazines, and box, and did see police use. So I expect this to be towards the high end of that. So anyway, really cool pistol. Happy to get that in and share it with you guys. Okay, last but not least is a very, very well-respected firearm. This one coming to us from a viewer in Arkansas. So thank you so much for selling this one to us. This is a Korth, and many of you who might know the name know what that is. This is the NXA Lightweight. It's the lightweight version of the NXS. 357 Magnum revolver, if I can get it out of here. This one coming with its 9mm conversion cylinder. Typically these are in 357 Magnum. Very, very nice and very well made revolver. Being a lightweight version, you do have like a anodized alloy sort of barrel shroud up here. This is an 8-round capacity of 357, of course the 9mm cylinder as well. It does have a push lever style of cylinder release right back at the end of the revolver, which is interesting. You don't see that too often. The action is really, really smooth. That is very nice. I'm going to give it 1 double action pull. Easy to stage right there. Just so nice and very, very smooth. The grips are actually lightning cut on the inside to reduce weight as well. Very, very highly precise, very well made revolver. Now, these are actually made in cooperation from Korth and Nighthawk Custom. Korth is a German manufacturing company that has been known for making very precisely manufactured firearms, specifically revolvers. And of course, Nighthawk Custom here in the United States is also known for making custom firearms, especially in the 1911 variety. They started coming out to the market with these, and they are very successful. Again, this is about as premium as you're going to get in a revolver. Brand new, the build cost on one of these standard is at about $5,300, and that's without the spare cylinder. So they can get upwards of around the $6,000 mark new, and you have to wait probably a year or longer to get one when they start building it for you. This one appears to me to be unfired. It is in excellent like new condition. There's no gunpowder residue anywhere beyond maybe from what was in a factory. Even the back face is completely clean, so I don't even think this has been fired beyond maybe a factory test fire. But there's really not a lot else to say about it. It's just a really stunning, beautiful firearm. I wanted to make sure it was captured in this video, as I've never actually had a Korth revolver in here before. So anyway, we're going to leave this video here with this Korth NXA 357 revolver. Well, that is all the time I have for you today on these. Thank you so much for stopping by and checking out this video. If you enjoyed, please let me know by hitting that like button. Please also consider subscribing to my channel and hit that bell notification button so you are aware when we are posting new content. Anyway, with that, guys, I'm going to leave you off there. I am Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports and WeBuyGuns.com. You are watching Marksman TV, and I will see you next time.